Life isn't always fair. Sometimes we find ourselves in a desolate place, betrayed and abandoned by those we trusted. But just as King David showed kindness to Mephibosheth, so God promises to extend His grace and kindness to us, even in our lowest, most hopeless moments. No matter the hardships we face, God has a place for us at His table. In the book of 2 Samuel chapter 9, we meet a man named Mephibosheth, a man whose life seemed marked by tragedy and loss. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, and as a young child, his life was forever altered. When the news of Saul's defeat came, the nurse who was taking care of him in his infancy fled in panic, dropping him in the process. The fall left him crippled in both feet, a disability that would stay with him for life. As a young man, Mephibosheth would have grown up knowing the weight of his family's defeat, carrying the stigma of being from the line of Saul, Israel's former king, whose family had fallen out of favor. But his story takes an unexpected turn in 2 Samuel chapter 9, when King David, after securing his throne, seeks to fulfill a promise made to his dear friend Jonathan, to show kindness to his descendants. David asked, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul, to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. It was Ziba, Saul's servant, who responded to the king's question. Ziba provided the crucial information that Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, who was still alive, though crippled in both feet. Ziba said to David, "Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet." 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 3. David immediately inquired, "Where is he?" And Ziba told him that Mephibosheth was living in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodebar, a place that symbolized abandonment and desolation. At the news of this, King David's heart was stirred. He did not hesitate to act, but sent messengers to retrieve Mephibosheth, bringing him to the palace. Imagine, for a moment, the life of Mephibosheth. Crippled and living in Lodebar, he was likely resigned to a life of obscurity, forgotten by most, and bearing the shame of his family's fall from grace. The house of Saul had been defeated, and the former king's descendants were often seen as enemies. Mephibosheth had no wealth, no power, and certainly no reason to expect anything from the king. But then David, remembering the covenant he had made with Jonathan, sought him out. "Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually." 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7. For someone like Mephibosheth, who had lived in such pain and desolation, David's words must have been overwhelming. The king was offering him not only a place at the royal table, but a complete restoration of the land that had belonged to Saul. This was a gesture of grace, a gesture that completely changed Mephibosheth's life. Mephibosheth, humbled by the king's mercy, responded, "What is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am?" 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 8. He saw himself as unworthy, even to receive such kindness, but David's response was clear. Mephibosheth was not just being shown mercy. He was being elevated to a position of honor. David didn't stop at just inviting Mephibosheth to the table. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9 to 10, David spoke directly to Ziba, Saul's servant, and gave him a command that would ensure Mephibosheth's continued well-being and provision. Then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, "I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul, and to all his house. Thou, therefore, and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth thy master's son shall eat bread alway at my table. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9 to 10. David instructed Ziba, along with his sons and servants, to work the land that had once belonged to Saul and his family, and to bring in the harvests for Mephibosheth. Ziba's household would be responsible for the labor of the land, ensuring that Mephibosheth was provided for, while Mephibosheth himself would enjoy the privilege of eating at the king's table forever. David made sure that Mephibosheth was cared for, not just with temporary kindness, but with the ongoing provision of land, food, and the labor of Ziba and his servants. Mephibosheth would no longer live in obscurity or want. Instead, he was restored to a position of honor and security. His father's estate was confirmed to him by the king, and Ziba was called to be a witness to it. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9. It seems Saul had a substantial estate, with fields and vineyards to bestow, as seen in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 7. Mephibosheth, now master of all of it, would have been in a much better position than he ever imagined. Ziba was entrusted with managing this estate, something he knew well from his time serving Saul. Ziba's numerous family members, 15 sons and 20 servants, would help manage the land and care for it. But they would also live off the income generated from it, making Mephibosheth's estate a source of wealth. In fact, all that dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 12, living off the estate while serving him. Ziba, for his part, was pleased with the situation, having wealth and abundance. "As the king has commanded, so will thy servant do," he said, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 11, making sure the land was properly tended to. Yet, David still insisted that Mephibosheth would eat at his table, and this was a decision that Mephibosheth himself was equally pleased with. When Absalom's rebellion erupted, David found himself fleeing Jerusalem, desperate for safety. In this vulnerable moment, Ziba saw an opportunity. Ziba approached David with a heavy heart, carrying donkey loads of provisions, and claiming that Mephibosheth had abandoned him to support Absalom's uprising. Ziba's words were convincing, and David, in his exhausted state, made a hasty decision. Without hearing Mephibosheth's side, David immediately stripped Mephibosheth of all his land and wealth, giving it to Ziba. David told Ziba, "I have given all that belonged to Mephibosheth to you." 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 4. In that moment, Ziba's deceit paid off. He was granted the land, the servants, and all the wealth that had once belonged to Mephibosheth. This was a clear example of Ziba's greed, and how he was willing to betray a man who had once shown him kindness, just to secure more for himself. His actions were not driven by loyalty to David, but by the hope of gaining more power and control over the land that had been entrusted to Mephibosheth. But the story doesn't end there. Despite the betrayal, Mephibosheth's heart shows us something truly remarkable. When David finally returns to Jerusalem after the chaos of the rebellion, the truth begins to unfold. Rather than coming with bitterness or accusations, Mephibosheth approaches the king with a humble heart and a desire for reconciliation. When David returned to Jerusalem, Mephibosheth made his way to the king's court. His appearance was striking, his beard untrimmed, his feet unwashed, and his clothes soiled, a sign of his mourning and grief since David had fled the city. For the entire time that David was in exile, Mephibosheth had been in a state of mourning, not caring for his appearance, because his heart was heavy. As Mephibosheth approached, David questioned him, saying, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 25. David, in his confusion over the events, still did not know the full truth. He had trusted Ziba's report, but now, standing before Mephibosheth, the king would finally hear the man's side of the story. Mephibosheth replied humbly, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For thy servant said, I will saddle me an ass, that I may ride thereon, and go to the king, because thy servant is lame. And he hath slandered thy servant unto my lord, the king." 2 Samuel chapter 19, verses 26 to 27. Mephibosheth had not betrayed David. He had been left behind, unable to escape, and Ziba had maliciously turned the story against him. David, realizing the truth, was faced with a difficult decision. He asked, "Why speakest thou any more of thy matters? I have said, thou and Ziba divide the land." 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 29. But Mephibosheth, with a heart full of humility and gratitude, did not ask for the land to be fully restored. Instead, he said, "Let him take it all, forasmuch as my lord the king is come again in peace unto his own house." 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 30. Here, Mephibosheth's heart is revealed. Despite the injustice, he chose not to demand what was rightfully his. His heart was more focused on honoring the king's return than on claiming his property. Mephibosheth's story is a profound illustration of grace, humility, and loyalty. Even after facing deceit and betrayal, Mephibosheth did not seek revenge or resentment. He chose instead to honor the king and acknowledge the grace shown to him even in the midst of difficult circumstances. For us, this story is a reminder of how God extends His grace toward us, even when we are undeserving. Like Mephibosheth, we are invited to His table, not because we've earned it, but because of His love and faithfulness. And just as Mephibosheth humbly accepted the king's invitation, we too are called to live lives of humility, honoring God with hearts full of gratitude for His kindness. Mephibosheth's story reminds us that God's love is not based on our circumstances or our mistakes, but on His unfailing mercy. He welcomes us to His table, no matter how broken or unworthy we may feel. No matter where you are in life, whether you're living in a low debar of your own or have been wronged by those you trusted, remember that God's table is always open to you. His grace is sufficient, His love is unwavering, and no matter how many times we may fall, He is always there to restore us.
In a world of broken promises, where shadows often reign, a young boy lost his footing, left with endless pain. The house of Saul was shattered, his family cast away. In Lo-debar forgotten, his hope began to fray. But the king asked, who remains? Is there one I can show grace? From desolation's depth he lifted up his face. A seat at the table where love breaks every chain, grace for the broken, healing every pain. Though unworthy we may feel, God's faithfulness is true. At the king's table there's a place for me and you. From Lo-debar to David's court, his crippled feet drew near, expecting wrath or judgment, but finding mercy here. The king spoke words of kindness, do not fear, my son. All that was your father's will now be returned. And though he saw himself a dog, unworthy of such care, the king declared his value, gave him love beyond compare. Seat at the table where love breaks every chain, grace for the broken, healing healing every pain. Though unworthy we may feel, God's faithfulness is true. At the King's table there's a place for me and you. When the world turns cold and friends betray, when greed and lies take trust away, still a heart of humility shines through. Grace will find its way to you. Mephibosheth stood humble, his truth was finally known, his loyalty unshaken, though his land was overthrown. And when the king returned again, his mercy shone so bright. For grace restores the broken and turns the wrong to right. A seat at the table where love breaks every chain. Grace for the broken, healing every pain. Though unworthy we may feel, God's faithfulness is true. At the King's table there's a place for me and you. Come to the table, no matter where you've been. Grace calls your name, it's where your new life begins. Though crippled by the fall, His love makes all things new. At the King's table there's a place for me and you.